From that, we'll move on to Jonathon Moreno. When we think about violence and crime, in addition to thinking about these acts perpetrated against the individual, we can also think about how these acts are perpetrated against our society at large and our nation. Jonathon will talk about the way neuroscience is affecting or influencing both national intelligence and national defense considerations now. Jonathon?
Thanks, Anjan. So for the last few years, I've been very interested in the relationship between the brain and behavior and what we're learning about the brain and behavior and the way that information could be used by the national security and national intelligence establishments. A few years ago, I published a book called Mind Wars about the history and ethics of neuroscience and national security. And since I published that book, I've had the opportunity to serve as an advisor to national intelligence agencies about the ethical and social implications of neuroscience for their work. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to describe how that interest that I've developed has taken me into several different areas, and not necessarily in this order, but these will be the themes that I'll be talking about. So the first is what are the current opportunities for the intelligence community and the national security community that emerging neuroscience might present? The second theme is what's the background, what's the history of national security establishment interest in the brain and human behavior and how they supported research in those areas. And the last is, has there been a kind of changing information flow, as I believe is true, between the national security world and the civilian science world? I actually am going to argue sort of toward the end that while decades ago the cutting edge research was often coming out of the national intelligence community about the brain and then going into the civilian world, and I'll give an example or two of that. Now I think what's happened is that the intelligence community is quite aware that it lacks the information about the brain that is being developed in the civilian world, and they're trying to adjust to that imbalance. So I want to start by reminding people about the ways that the intelligence community and the national security establishment in the United States has been interested in the brain and behavior really for a very long time. So consider, for example, the first IQ tests. The first IQ tests were actually developed during the First World War, the Great War, under military aegis, partly in order to screen soldiers for different abilities that they might have when they were in the service. During the Second World War, you had a very similar phenomenon. The thematic apperception tests, some more advanced psychometric tests were developed for the Army, by the Army, really in contract with some of the top scientists, psychologists, and social scientists in the country. And that information then went from the national security world, of course, into the civilian world. After the Second World War, as we know, in the 50s and 60s, the intelligence community was very interested in hallucinogens like LSD. And the idea was that perhaps LSD could be used as a truth serum to compromise an atomic scientist with a high security clearance to get atomic secrets from that person. Or perhaps it could be put in the water supply or aerosolized and used to confuse the enemy soldiers. This was of great interest in the 50s and 60s, and of course the irony is that this work on hallucinogens like LSD, but also mescaline and similar drugs, this work became the iconic drug of the 1960s. The LSD is the symbol of the counterculture. And it was really only in the mid-1970s, as a result of some congressional investigations, that it was uncovered that the original understanding of information about the effect of LSD actually came out of top research universities that were doing this work for the intelligence community in secret. In fact, there are some scholars who believe that the revelation of the CIA and Army LSD experiments in the 50s and 60s actually indirectly led to the tragedy of 9/11, because the allegation is the CIA was so embarrassed by these scandals in the mid-1970s that they pulled back on their clandestine activities. And as a result, there was poor human intelligence about what groups like Al-Qaeda were doing in the late 1990s and the early 21st century. So today, the intelligence community, the national security establishment, have tried to improve their comprehension of the brain and behavior and what neuroscience might be able to offer them. And I'll give a couple of examples of the interest that the national security world has in these things. And then I'll conclude by talking about the way that the information flow has changed, though it should be pretty obvious already from the comments I've made about this. So as we know from the neuroscience that you've heard already in this program, there are some really quite remarkable things happening. And you'll hear from Professor Morris about the deception and the idea that maybe we can improve lie detection using functional magnetic resonance imaging or other technologies to scan the brain. Those could obviously be very helpful in interrogation situations. But what if we could also give a drug, perhaps a naturally occurring brain hormone, like something called oxytocin, that you could get into a prisoner's nasal passages, get past the blood-brain barrier, and create a trusting sensibility on the part of the prisoner, so that you wouldn't have to waterboard, you wouldn't have to torture, you wouldn't have to play good cop, bad cop. The next person who came in the room after the prisoner had been exposed to this chemical had a trusting attitude toward this interrogator. So that might be a way to loosen somebody up, but would it be thought to be an inappropriate invasion of that person's privacy, as a philosopher might say, their very personhood? Or consider post-traumatic stress disorder. There's some evidence, although it's not well established, that beta blockers can help to relieve people of the emotions associated with these traumatic situations. And perhaps with psychotherapy, it can help them to manage their symptoms of trauma. Well, what if you could give, say, a combat soldier a beta blocker before that person went into combat, so that they would perhaps remember the terrible things that they had seen and had to do in combat, but they might not associate those terrible things with emotions that would cause a post-traumatic stress. Now, if you could do that, in theory, you could perhaps develop soldiers who didn't feel guilty, didn't feel shame, didn't feel very negative emotions about what they had experienced in combat. And the benefit of that is that you would have perhaps prevented them from having post-traumatic stress. But would that be ethically acceptable? Would it be acceptable? Would it be desirable for society to have, in effect, guilt-free soldiers? A further out sort of idea doesn't have necessarily to do with drugs or chemicals, but has to do with the possibility that through perhaps implants in the brain, you could actually have a person in a bunker feeling as though they were in the environment of a robot that was in a combat situation, that was in the battlefield. That robot could be a robot that would fire a weapon or do reconnaissance, or perhaps it's, as we have now already, it's a pilotless aircraft, a drone aircraft, and that individual in the bunker can actually control that aircraft, that robot in the air, and fire weapons and do reconnaissance. That would be a great improvement, perhaps, over the kinds of control that we have now over drones, over pilotless drones, over robots in the field, because you'd have the instantaneous sense that you are actually in that creature, in that robot, and perhaps be able to function more effectively than we can control those robots now. Could we then have a kind of wirelessly controlled robot army? There are people who think that this is where we're going in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years in the military. That raises very interesting questions of political ethics and political philosophy. Perhaps it would lower the bar for a power being interested in getting into war because they would lose fewer people. But on the other hand, maybe that would attract the adversary, the terrorist, to the homeland, because they wouldn't be able to get to our fighters. Their fighters are just robots, they would have to come here. Those are questions we've never really had to address before. The last thing I want to say is sort of perhaps pretty obvious by now. A lot of the examples that one could use, and a couple of that I've described in the last couple of minutes, about the way that the national security or national intelligence world could use information from neuroscience has been coming from the civilian world in the last few years and is being taken from the civilian world into the national security establishment. Whereas in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that work was coming out of the national security establishment and then being brought into the civilian community. Take the example of LSD, which went from being a drug of interest to the intelligence community to a drug of interest on college campuses. So the information flow has changed. In my experience, serving on a couple of committees recently for the Defense Intelligence Agency, I've seen that the intelligence world in particular and the defense establishment in general is very aware that they don't have the expertise that they had 50 or 60 years ago. And so what you're going to see over the next few years, and already seeing now, is a much greater interest on the part of the Pentagon, on the part of the intelligence world, in trying to digest and integrate the information that's coming out of neuroscience and taking into the ways that we fight wars and conduct national intelligence efforts in the future.